The following is a WISN 12 special presentation, made possible by the support of the Marquette University Law School. Tonight, a Commitment 2019 WISN 12 News election special. The Wisconsin Supreme Court candidates debate. Two judges are running for a 10-year term on Wisconsin's highest court. Appeals Court Chief Judge Lisa Neubauer of Racine.
Everybody that comes before our Supreme Court has to have a fair shake.
And Appeals Court Judge Brian Hagedorn of Oconomowoc.
It's the law that's written that governs, and that's the message that I'm running on.
Tonight, the candidates on the job of a justice, their views of the law, and recent controversies in the race. And now, live from Eckstein Hall, the home of the Marquette Law School, here is tonight's moderator, Mike Goucher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's debate. We are coming to you live from the Lubar Center in Eckstein Hall at Marquette University Law School, where I work as a fellow in law and public policy. Two candidates are seeking an open seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Appeals Court judges Brian Hagedorn and Lisa Neubauer join me for what we hope will be a robust discussion of the law and the choice before voters. The winner of the April 2nd election will replace retiring Justice Shirley Abrahamson, Wisconsin's first female justice, also its longest-serving justice. Before we get to the questions, here's some background on each candidate. Judge Hagedorn is a Brookfield, Wisconsin native, grew up in Milwaukee. He graduated from Northwestern University Law School. He worked for the Foley and Lardner law firm for several years. He clerked for former Justice Michael Gableman and served as an assistant attorney general. In 2011, he became chief legal counsel to former Governor Scott Walker, who appointed him to the 2nd District Court of Appeals in 2015. Judge Neubauer is from Racine. She graduated from the University of Chicago Law School. She clerked for U.S. District Court Judge Barbara Crabb. She also worked at Foley and Lardner for 19 years. Former Governor Doyle appointed her to the 2nd District Court of Appeals in 2007, and she became Chief Judge of the Appeals Court in 2015. Thanks to both of you for being with us tonight. We appreciate it. Our rules are pretty simple tonight. This is a conversation. I'll be talking to the candidates about how they view the job of a Supreme Court justice and some issues that have emerged in this campaign. I'll be asking the candidates to answer questions directly and concisely. The candidates may speak to each other, but I'll be managing the time on any given topic, and I'll move the conversation along if necessary. Toward the end of the hour, each candidate will make a closing statement. We flipped a coin to determine who gets the first question tonight, and so we'll begin with Judge Neubauer. Judge, good to have you here tonight. Let's be blunt about this. What's at stake in this election?
Thank you for having me, Mike. Thank you to WISN and to the Marquette Law School for having this and for organizing this. There is so much at stake in this election. This is an extraordinarily important race, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to speak with you and the voters. What's at stake in this election is whether our next justice is going to be somebody who has the experience, the qualifications, and for the job, and who is going to be fair, impartial, and independent. I have over 30 years in the law, as you said in the introduction. I was a litigator for almost 20 years. I've been on the Court of Appeals now for 11. I was appointed by our Supreme Court to be the chief judge of our 16-member Court of Appeals in 2015 and 2018. I also bring a lot of life experience and a lot of things that I've done in my career to this job. So I've been really involved in doing, what I can with my time, my talents, and my skills to serve. And I've been really involved in that regard in United Way in Racine and being on boards of entities that have provided legal services to the poor. I've done a lot of pro bono litigation for people who needed representation. And I have been tutor in the Racine Public Schools, many other activities as well. But most importantly for this race, I have been a judge on the Court of Appeals for 11 years. And in that role, I have a strong record that shows that I am tough but fair, and that I am fair, impartial, and independent. No thumb on the scale, no agenda, no bias, no predetermined outcome. And that's what we need on our next Supreme Court justice.
Judge Hagedorn, thanks to you for being with us tonight. I'll give you the same opportunity. What's at stake in this race?
Well, this race really is about the future of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I think my opponent and I agree on that. And ultimately, I think the core question is judicial philosophy. You know, in what philosophy do you bring to the bench? What do you understand the job of a judge to be? And I believe my role as a judge is to say what the law is and not what I think the law should be. And that's what the rule of law means. It means it's not what I think, it's not my policy preferences, it's not is this fair, unfair, it's not do I like it or not like it, it's not was this passed by Republicans or Democrats, it's what does the law actually say. Same thing with the Constitution. You look at what it actually says. You interpret it according to its original public meaning. And you enforce the rights we have in there, rights like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, and many other rights as well. And I think, you know, the key difference between my opponent and I here is that my opponent has upheld as a model the justice we want to replace. Somebody who, quite frankly, has been very political on the bench. Somebody who has had a thumb on the scale. Somebody who I know from experience because I have litigated significant cases before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I've worked there. I've clerked there. I've seen there. I've been there. I've seen what happens at the court. And the last thing I want to see our court is another political branch of government. We have too much of that. And that's really what's at stake. Do we want our Supreme Court to be a place that becomes the political playground for people who have a political agenda for the court, or are we going to have a court that's fundamentally committed to the rule of law and upholding the Constitution as written?
He says his concern is about the court being politicized. Do you share that concern?
Yeah, I mean, I would point, frankly, to my opponent's answer in this very discussion. He continues, as he has every single day on this campaign trail, to signal where he's going to be coming out on things. And when he stands up before these people and says, my judicial philosophy is nonpartisan, he's running one of the most partisan campaigns we've seen in recent history.
Give me an example of what you're talking about.
For example, he talks about Justice Abrahamson. He is criticizing a current member of the court. He has announced the support of two other members of the court in his opening day of his campaign. I have not sought the support of justices on our Supreme Court because if I'm elected, I would intend to go up there and work with every single member of that court. It is not appropriate to be picking a camp in the course of one's campaign from day one. And he is signaling, as he has in so many things we've seen in this campaign, where he's going to be.
I want to ask you to respond to that. She says you're signaling what your intentions would be should you be the next state Supreme Court justice.
Sure. I'm not sure how I'm signaling by talking about my judicial philosophy and having the support of 5 Supreme Court justices who were very eager to line up behind my campaign.
2 current and 3 retired.
That's right, because they've seen my work. They know up front. They're the ones who actually look at what we do, and I'm really proud to have that support. My opponent doesn't really want to share what her judicial philosophy is. She has not been willing to answer questions about justices she admires or doesn't admire, and I think that's really problematic. You know, we as a society, as a culture, and in the legal system, we actually have differences of opinion, not about politics, but about the judicial philosophy that ought to govern what we do. And the reality is the justice we're seeking to replace, again, I know this. I have litigated some of the most significant cases in state history, and I could tell you how that justice was going to vote on every single case that I had. She was going to go to vote against my client because she didn't like my client's politics or policies. And that is wrong. That is the problem. And for anyone to look at that legacy, as my opponent has, and she's given her money, this is not just her public statements, but anybody who can look at that legacy and say, let's keep going on that, as Judge Neubauer has said, is somebody who absolutely is not going to be impartial on the bench. It's somebody who's, quite frankly, signaled that she wants to follow in the legacy of the political decision-making that I've had enough of at the court, and I think the voters of Wisconsin have too.
Yes.
Yeah. When I announced my campaign, I said that I had admiration for Justice Abrahamson, who my opponent has vilified pretty much in every appearance we've been in, many times. Already 2 in this debate. She was the first woman on our Supreme Court. She was elected by the people of our state over 4 times. And, you know, I am the first woman on the Court of Appeals, District 2. I was the first woman to be presiding judge. I've been the first woman chief judge on our court. And I've been honored to mentor many young women, to mentor survivors of breast cancer as a breast cancer survivor myself, and to continue that role of providing mentorship and inspiration for younger women. It is odd to me that my opponent would be criticizing a current member of the court who obviously other members of the court have agreed with many times. And again, to me, this is, you know, this is he demeans a current member of the court and necessarily other members of the court. This is an issue of temperament. It is also odd to me that he has demeaned Sandra Day O'Connor in a blog that he wrote when he was 27 years old. He was the father of 2. He was a law intern at Foley and Lardner. And in that blog, he said that Sandra Day O'Connor's opinions were laughable. He said that the country would be better off without her on the court. Is this the kind of temperament? Is this the kind of demeaning behavior that we need on our Supreme Court? That people don't want that. We've had enough of that.
Let me have you give you a chance to respond.
Thank you. Well, certainly Justice Abrahamson has been a pioneer. Nobody's questioning that. Nobody would question her intelligence or her work ethic. I've seen it up close. There's much to commend what she's done on the court, but her judicial philosophy is not one of those things. And it is okay and appropriate for us to talk about our legitimate differences, about judicial philosophy. Everyone should be held to that standard. And even someone who was the first woman on the court, that's wonderful and that's great. We certainly don't have a glass ceiling on the Supreme Court with 6 of our 7 members being women, and that's wonderful. The real question here is judicial philosophy, and it's appropriate and okay for us to talk about that and have real discussions about it. My opponent doesn't want to talk about that. She's trying to distract from the real issues because she doesn't want to share what she believes, whereas I'm being transparent, honest about the philosophy that I'll bring to the bench.
Yes, briefly.
Yeah, I am happy to talk about my judicial philosophy.
How would you describe it?
I have talked about my judicial philosophy from day one in this campaign, and I have been utterly consistent about it. My judicial philosophy is that I follow the Constitution and I follow the law. That everyone that comes into our courts, whether it's at the circuit court level, the Court of Appeals, or the Supreme Court, needs to have confidence that there's no ideology, no thumb on the scale, no predetermined outcome. And the partisanization of our Supreme Court has undermined our people's confidence that when they walk through those courthouse doors, they're going to receive justice. We have to have a judiciary in our state that is the true third branch that everyone learned about in grade school civics. We have to have a judiciary that is nonpartisan. That's the kind of judge I've been. Now, one of the reporters recently said to me, "Lisa, is that a judicial philosophy?" Yes, it is. We don't have to always have this partisan lens coming to our courts. I have an 11-year track record of 3,000 plus decisions, no partisanship. And that's why I'm supported now by over 340 judges from around this state.
You have called yourself an originalist, a textualist. There are a fair number of people who are not attorneys watching this tonight. Yeah. So explain briefly what you're talking about, your philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, originalism and textualism is not aligned to any political party or anything along those lines, and Judge Neubauer is just incorrect on that. Originalism and textualism means what you do when you are reading the law is you look at what the law says. which is common sense. When I tell people that, that's the goal. Isn't that what all judges should be doing? And the answer is yes, that's what all judges should be doing. It means I read the law to mean what it actually says. It means I look at the language of the Constitution and interpret it according to its original public meaning, because that's what we do with words, and because that's the whole concept of the law. You know, the Constitution is a written document that is supposed to govern those who govern us. And so it's words that matter. And when the policies aren't good, then we throw the bums out. We ask them to write new statutes that we like. When the Constitution has provisions that are problematic, then we amend the Constitution, which we've done throughout our history. So that's originalism and textualism. And my job and my track record is to take the law and to follow it to its end. You know, Judge Neubauer and none of her allies have ever been able to criticize any case that I have decided. Why? Because I have been faithful to follow the law wherever it takes me. Whereas, again, Judge Neubauer is holding up as a model someone who has been political despite her rhetoric here tonight.
I'll give you a second to respond to that. He says that an originalist or a textualist, it's not necessarily a Republican or Democratic thing. It's not a liberal conservative thing. It's just its own definition. Do you buy that?
No, and again, I think that my opponent is continuing to just signal where he's going to be coming out on things. Of course, we start with the language of the Constitution. Of course, we look at what the intent was. But we also look at case law. We look at what's happened over time, what the decisions have been since then. And that's exactly the kind of judge I've been, and that's exactly the kind of justice I would be. You know, what I want to point out here is that when he professes to have this neutral judicial philosophy, we know that he had a blog where he laid forth his views on very fundamental constitutional issues that are going to impact the people in our state every single day. On the right to privacy, there is none in the Constitution, according to my opponent. On separation of church and state. And he says, oh, well, that was a long time ago. No, that was when he was the father of two, 27 years old, well into his legal career. And it's not just the writings in this blog, it's the actions. It's putting those legal interpretations into practice. Starting a school that bans gay children, teachers, parents, taking money from a group that's been labeled a hate group because their views are so extreme, criminalizing same-sex, sterilizing transgender people. He has done that as a judge when the robes are on.
I'd love an opportunity to respond to that. You know, Judge Neubauer is lying, and I'm sorry. I'd love to be able to tell you something that's less direct than that. But Judge Neubauer cannot criticize my cases. And so what she is doing is deliberately trying to undermine my reputation and attack me for things that she's just flat out wrong about, borrowing the very special interest talking points that she once derided as toxic, that now she's doing. And I think it's really unfortunate, Judge Neubauer, that you want to sacrifice your integrity to win a seat on the Supreme Court. You know, I'm happy to talk about these issues here, but I think this kind of name-calling, the vile name-calling that my opponent is doing here is unbecoming of a judge. That's a temperament problem. Let me address the specifics here. We did start a Christian school. My family's here in the audience, by the way. You know, it's interesting, Mike, when you and I sat down the very first time I gave a public interview, it was with you on Upfront. And you said to me, I don't know if you remember this, but I do. You said to me before we got on the air, you said, you know, Judge, I said, by the time this campaign is done, you are going to be a caricature of yourself. You're not even going to recognize what you read about yourself.
I say that to all the candidates.
I know.
Just
Good
so you know.
For you.
Yeah.
Good for you. And unfortunately, that's been true. And the worst part here is that now my opponent's trying to make up things to further that along. We did start a school.
Just let him finish and we'll come back.
Yes. We did start this school. You know, my daughter here is in the audience as well, Olivia, and she went to the school. She's 13. She said to me the other day, she said, you know, Dad, she said, it's interesting that those people who know the least about you are saying the most about you. And they're saying things that are just not true. And that's where we are here. With the school, we started a school that has a code of conduct for teachers, not parents or students. And it is no different than you'd find at almost any other school out there. We treat everyone with respect. I always treat everyone with respect. Nobody has alleged anything differently about the way I conduct myself in my personal life and my professional life. And to say that you can't volunteer at your kid's Christian school, that disqualifies you from the bench, that is an attack on people of faith, and it's shameful and it's wrong.
Let me come back to you, and then I'm going to follow up one more time.
Yes.
On this.
I mean, so many things to address. This is not about making stuff up. This is information that has come directly from Judge Hagedorn. The writings on the blog, those are his words, written words that he published to the world. These are facts. This is not made up material. The information about the school, their facts are out there about the scope of the policy. And this is not about faith. This theme of this is an attack on faith. I'm a woman of faith. My family and I have belonged to a church in Racine for 30 years. But this is not about faith. This is not about us. This is about the public and the public's confidence that the people that they're electing to our Supreme Court are going to come without predetermined outcomes, without ideology, without bias. And these are facts that the public has to consider, not only about whether this person is going to be fair, impartial, and independent, but about their temperament. And the 340 judges, that's 98% of the judges. My opponent has 5 judges supporting him. Why is that? Because they trust me to be fair, non-biased, impartial.
Judge Hagedorn, let me ask you a couple really brief questions.
Yes.
Do you have any regrets about the things you wrote in your blogs when you were a bit younger? In your mid-20s?
Sure. I have never put any of those things front and center, and my view here is that I'm not running on my personal views or, quite frankly, some of my legal musings as a law student. And so, to the extent they're related to legal issues, they're obviously things that I can't really talk about because cases could come before me. To the extent they're personal policy views or political views, I'm not running on those things. And the fact that my opponent can't even name one case where I've brought my personal views to bear shows that these are not facts, these are smears.
I would like to respond to that. The one case mantra that my opponent keeps saying, he's only been on the court for a few years. And you don't have to ask me about what I think. I have declined to do that because we do sit on the same court and there is a component of collegiality here. But you can ask the judges in our district, the judges who we hear, the judges who sit on the cases we hear the appeals from. Now, our court has 12 counties, 64 judges. Every single endorsing judge in those counties is supporting me. All the judges endorsing in Kenosha, Racine, Walworth, Washington, Ozaukee, Waukesha, Winnebago, Fond du Lac, Sheboygan, Manitowoc, they know our work. They know my work. And every endorsing judge, if you look at our websites, is supporting me.
You look like you want to say something. We can continue to pursue this, or we can try and move it a bit forward. Did you have a final thought on this?
Sure. Let me just say this. First of all, again, that's not true. I'm proud to have the support of judges across the state. I was just up in Marinette County. I was with Chief Judge Jim Morrison and District Attorney Deshae Morrow, who are supporting my campaign. Jason Roselle, Jody Meyer, Mike Maxwell, Mike Abrahamian, your former colleague, Paul Bugenhagen, Maria Lazar from Waukesha County. All those are endorsing me. Kendall Kelly, Green Bay, Steve Gibbs up in Chippewa. I've got judges all across the state.
My opponent has not listed anybody publicly.
That's fine, but they're supporting me, and so I'm happy to say that you're incorrect on that. Again, I just want to point out with these things, nobody can point to any case that I've decided, and Judge Neubauer and I have decided hundreds of cases together. And she was asked in the last debate, tell me one time when you've allowed your personal views to impact your decision making, and she couldn't do it. The best way to foster collegiality in the court is not to lie and smear about your colleague, as you have done repeatedly in this campaign.
I'm going to move forward here. So one thing that I think is striking to the average voter is the fact that in these races, oftentimes, judges or candidates will say, judge me on how I performed on the bench. But forget about the stuff I did in the past. That should not be a part of it. I've set those beliefs aside. And I want to spend a couple minutes on that because each of you have had partisan pasts. Lisa Neubauer, you gave money, you and your husband gave money to Democratic causes and candidates for a number of years. You personally gave $8,000 to Jim Doyle, who appointed you later to the bench. You gave money to Barack Obama's presidential campaign. Doesn't it strike an average person? They might say, wow, there seems to be a predisposition to how she might go about things. You've taken money from Tom Steyer, the Democratic activist, who's one of your big contributors, who wants to impeach Donald Trump. Why should people not have some doubt about whether all of their political beliefs have been laid aside?
Because I have an 11-year track record, literally thousands of cases. And when I joined the judiciary, I understand what our role is. And I understand that our role is to follow the Constitution, follow the law, do not bring personal views to the bench, and do not bring partisan views to the bench. And that is exactly what I have done for 11 years, literally 3,000 plus cases. I have 340 judges. Why? Red county, blue county, 98%. Why are they supporting me? Because they trust me to continue to do the job that I have done. I really understand that our role is the nonpartisan role. My opponent is running one of the most partisan campaigns in recent history. Oh. He's taking money, he's passing money, as you know, in the last report, with the Republican Party of Wisconsin. We learned yesterday $1 million is coming in from a shadowy Republican national organization.
Outside money.
Outside money to demonize me.
Right.
It is a
but there are outside money being spent to support you that demonizes him too,
well,
correct?
at the very beginning of this race, I called on the outside money to stay out. I have I believed that then. I believe it now. Did you personally
talk to the people? Did you talk to Attorney General Holder?
No, I mean, I learned about it in the paper. But I called on that money to stay out. I don't believe my opponent has done anything of the sort.
Well, let me have him address that.
And it is a problem for our judiciary. It is one of the main reasons I'm running is that we have to get our judiciary out of the grips of the attempts to partisanize our courts.
So let me have you address this. I'll just turn the question around because at one time you were a member of the Republican Party. We've talked about the blog postings already. You worked as the chief legal counsel to Governor Walker. There are folks who are going to look at that track record and they're going to say, and I haven't talked about the outside money that just came into the race from the Republican group that she just mentioned. People are going to say, come on, we know where you come down on these things. We know what's going on here. Mm-hmm. Don't you think the public has a right to be skeptical about objectivity, impartiality, fairness?
They do. And they do have a right to be skeptical about it because we've had judges that over time have done the very thing, like the justice we're seeking to replace, who has been political on the bench, who Judge Neubauer holds up as a model. And so the remedy for that, of course, is for judges to not do that. Now, since I've been in law school and after that, I have been somebody who's regularly spoken out about the role of a judge, and I believed it to my core, is to set aside your views. You know, my experience with the governor, I'm really proud of that. You know, I was not doing political work. I was doing high-level legal work. I was dealing with cases at the United States Supreme Court. I was dealing with cases in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I was dealing with cases in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. I was giving significant advice at the highest of levels that prepares me well. You know, President Obama, he nominated now Justice Kagan to the Supreme Court. She was his top lawyer, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. And so it's normal for people to have government service experience in their background that prepares them well for service on the court. So I'm proud of that. But again, on the court, my job is different. You know, when we put on the robe, we say it doesn't matter what your personal views are. That's why we wear black robes and not capes, because we're not here to rule the world. We're not here for the rule of judges, which I'm concerned about. We're here to set aside our views and apply the law. And once again, I've done that faithfully, and nobody can look at my judicial record, deciding hundreds of cases with my opponent, and say anything otherwise.
So here's a question I have for you. In the last couple of days, we found out this Republican group is going to put in 7 figures to try to help get you elected in this race. You have criticized her in recent weeks for not being strong enough, not being forceful enough, and telling outside groups to stay out. Have you told that group to stay out? Have you said they should stay out of this race?
I have never said that to groups. Judge Neubauer has. My criticism of Judge Neubauer has been that she's been inconsistent. You know, she said early on, this money is toxic, it needs to get out of the race.
Do you think the money is toxic? Do you think it's toxic in our Supreme Court elections today?
I do think that she's correct on that. What's troubling to me is that Judge Neubauer just wants to repeat their same talking points. I believe deeply in the freedom of speech. The court matters, and who we have in the court matters. The judicial philosophy that governs the court will impact our state for years and years to come. People have a right to speak, and I don't think we have a place as judges to say you can't speak, particularly when you put $250,000 of your own money into the race as well. I think that the right to free speech should be exercised responsibly, and it often is not. But the remedy to the money in our races is not just no money. The remedy is for judges to do their jobs faithfully. And when they do, and when they stop acting like a super legislature, the people in these elections will stop treating them that way.
We talked earlier. Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll follow up on that.
Look at what he does and not what he says. He is exchanging tens of thousands of dollars with the Republican Party of Wisconsin, which showed up in his campaign finance report yesterday.
$42,000. Yes.
Yeah. So and again, you know, this discussion about the money in the outside race, I have been perfectly consistent about that. I said on day one, I called on the money to stay out. I believed it then. I believe it now. And the going forward issue that's so important for our state is whether judges need to recuse.
So what should we do on that? Right now, justices determine for themselves whether they should recuse. You know, what should they do?
To set the table for the viewers at home, our Supreme Court adopted a rule several years ago that basically said no amount of money is an issue. And so a lot of judges got together and put a petition before the Supreme Court that would have addressed the millions of dollars coming into our races. And our Supreme Court didn't even have a hearing, which to me is shameful. This race is about a democracy. That issue is tied up with that issue because our people have to have confidence that the justices are going to be impartial, nonpartisan.
So
I have called for a stronger rule. My opponent has not. He's been very wishy-washy on it.
So real life potential example. So Eric Holder's group, which has been pushing for changes to redistricting, somehow they're involved in a case that comes before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Could you, given the fact that they've put forth about $350,000 to help try to get you elected, could you hear that case? Could you reasonably sit on that case?
You know, what I have said is I would not sit on a case involving that group. And again, I think we need to go forward. We need to think forward. I called on the outside money to stay out of this race. It's obviously in. So the question is, who do you want, voters, public, who do you want to go on that Supreme Court and really work towards getting our court so that it is, in fact, a nonpartisan branch, the Supreme Court, a nonpartisan court. And again, you know, I've been on the court for 11 years. I've got a long record. And, you know, the not only all the endorsing judges in our district, on our Court of Appeals, these are the people that probably know our decisions, our work ethic, our temperament the best. of anybody in this state. And I have 25 Court of Appeals judges supporting me.
I want to get Judge Hagedorn in on this question, and that is, what about recusal? What do we do?
I serve on the Wisconsin Judicial Commission. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has appointed me to the Judicial Commission, which oversees the Code of Judicial Conduct. So I'm very well aware of the types of issues, and that's where recusal, those types of issues, if there were an issue, that's where it would come to the body that I sit on. So I'm well aware of those types of issues. I'm certainly open to discussion about these sorts of issues. I think
what does that mean exactly, that you're open to a discussion?
Well, I mean, Judge Neubauer hasn't said anything specific either, so it seems that she's open for a discussion too, which is nobody's coming forward with a specific proposal and saying, I want X, Y, or Z. We're simply saying, let's open it up and have a conversation. I think we share the same goal. People who come before the court should feel like the court is a place where money's not going to influence their decisions. And I think by and large that's true. In fact, I know by and large that that's true because I sit on the place where complaints would happen. So I'm always open to discussion on that. But to me, recusal is also, particularly over contributions, is a side issue over other major questions, which is building confidence in our courts. And again, the main issue is having courts where people don't feel the incentive to invest in these races because judges are just going to follow the law rather than judges having a central place in deciding every controversial political question of the day and all of a sudden becoming another political branch. And that's what I don't want to see.
Recusal is not just about money. Could it be about things, for example, that you wrote during your days about Planned Parenthood and other organizations? Would you have to recuse yourself from cases like that? Or cases that you handled as the governor's chief legal counsel?
Yeah, of course. There's direct conflicts that could come. For example, if I worked on an issue, then I would recuse from that type of issue that came about. The same rule that would apply to any other judges. I mean, again, going back to Justice Kagan, when she was nominated by President Obama, she did not sit on cases that she had worked on when she was in the Solicitor General's office. When she became a justice, she didn't sit on those cases, but she did work on other cases. So, of course, I will follow those rules, as I always have, and will continue to do so.
The recusal issue is a really important issue, and it's not at its core. The question is, if cases come before our courts, can the public or the parties who come before the court have confidence that this is a person who is not going to come to the decision with a predetermined outcome or a bias or an ideology? My opponent, when you talk about his writings, has already opined on very fundamental constitutional issues, and he has acted upon them with this aligning himself with taking money year after year after year from a group described as a hate group. He has put out so many statements calling Planned Parenthood wicked, writing a blog post about why I hate Planned Parenthood, calling Mitt Romney's Mormon religion heresy, calling the NAACP a disgrace to America. There is so much information out there that the public needs to consider in determining, is this somebody who is going to be fair and impartial?
Quick follow-up, and then I'll come back to you, Judge.
Thank you.
So Planned Parenthood has given about $120,000 to help try to get you elected. Could you hear a case involving Planned Parenthood?
Again, I read about that in the paper. I called on the outside money to stay out. And, going forward, I would look at every case, who are the parties, what are the issues, and I would consider it. I have always held myself to the highest ethical standards in my 11 years on the Court of Appeals, and I would continue to do that. I want to point out that my opponent has not committed in recusing on cases like Act 10 that he helped draft and defended as a lawyer. And again, there are so many issues and cases, lawsuits, laws that he was involved with, and I haven't heard any kind of commitment, even when he was a lawyer advocating in those cases.
There's a lot in her previous answer, and in that answer, I'll give you a little time here to address it.
Thank you. Thank you. I find it really interesting that she points to comments from when I was a law student years ago as grounds for maybe I need to recuse, yet she's received $120,000 from Planned Parenthood, and that seems to be just fine, or she's going to consider it a little bit further. That's pretty interesting. Let me talk about a couple of the issues that she's raised, because once again, Judge Newbar, what she's trying to do here is she's trying to caricature me. She's trying to personally make up things about me to present to all of you and all the voters out there that I'm somebody that I'm not. And she knows that. She knows that we've worked together, which makes it all the more disappointing. I gave speeches to a legal organization that is regularly arguing and winning cases in the United States Supreme Court. They're one of the leading public interest religious liberty groups in the country. They're regularly arguing and winning cases, and I've been invited back to speak to law students. And what I call to them is to consider state and local public service, to come back home, don't just take the big job in D.C. or work at a big law firm. Come back home and consider public service in your home community. And my opponent thinks that that apparently is really problematic. And so what does she do? She calls them names. A group that, by the way, has appeared before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and my opponent now just wants to slur, borrowing a designation that comes from a disgraced group right now that just fired their former founder, that just has been successfully sued for libel and defamation against other groups. On the NAACP piece, I need to respond to that because Judge Newbar is really, once again, just trying to mislead voters, and it's so disappointing. I regularly wrote, even then, how deeply committed I was to racial reconciliation. In fact, I regularly critiqued the party that I was a part of for not taking those issues seriously enough. That it was a deep conviction of mine that human dignity requires that. And I was criticizing the organization at that time had a leader that was engaging in far more partisan decision-making. And my critique of the organization was that by doing that, by aligning itself with one political party, it is actually not able to carry out the goal of racial reconciliation as effectively. And again, Judge Newbar is just misleading people. And it's so disappointing to see that she cannot point to any cases where I've done this, and so she simply wants to call me names, and that's wrong. It's not what this race should be about.
Mike, these are his writings. These are his words. This is not me making stuff up. These are his words. He described himself as a self-described cultural warrior in that blog. And all of this information is out there. And it would be one thing if it was, long ago, but he has acted upon it by aligning himself with this group. And the speeches that he mentions, we haven't seen them. People have asked for them. Where are the speeches? He's not willing to release them. So this is really about, again, it's about the public looking at this information. Do we feel that folks coming before our court are going to get a fair shake? So
I asked this question. I think I see Justice Dallett in the audience tonight. I asked this last year when she was running for state Supreme Court. And I said, given what happens in these campaigns, the outside money that floods in, the discussions we have about when should we recuse because of financial contributions to help our campaigns, do either of you think that we're going about this the wrong way, that half the states in America say merit selection is a better way to go? Justice Jean Geske, a former professor at this law school, said, I never wanted to believe that, but I'm at that point now because I don't like what's happened to our campaigns. Do you give that any thought? Judge Hagedorn, I'll begin with you.
This is one of the few issues where founders actually had a pretty robust debate in 1848 when they were debating our Constitution. And they came down on the side and said, what we want to do is we want to keep politics out of the court. And we want to keep politics out of the court, so we're going to do elections so that we don't have the smoke-filled back room, where people don't have an opportunity for the people to weigh in and check that. This is the people's Constitution. It's not just a lawyer's Constitution. The worst of all possible worlds to me is a world where It's controlled by lawyers in this small political class of people. And I'm going to give you an example for that. When I was working for Governor Walker, I would go to these national conferences with other chief legal counsels from around the country. And I was talking at lunch with some of the chief legal counsels from, in this situation, it was Vermont and Massachusetts. And they were extolling the virtues of their system. And I said, I've got a question for you. Could Justice Scalia make it through your commission? And to his credit, the gentleman from Vermont said, no, he couldn't. And what happens inevitably in these systems is those who actually have core convictions about originalism and textualism, those get weeded out because, unfortunately, our judicial system, our political system, our legal system it needs some serious reformation. What we do now does not work wonderfully well. I knew going into this race that I was going to be maligned. I didn't think it would be quite so much by my opponent here who would make things up about me. But I knew that going into that my reputation was going to be denigrated. I think that's unfortunate and it's not good for our court. The remedy would be for a reparation of a healing of our reformation of our political culture. A political culture that doesn't just do what Judge Neubauer keeps doing here tonight.
I have to ask you one quick follow-up. The ad by this Republican group that is just starting compares the attacks on you, this is what the ad says, with the attacks on Justice Kavanaugh. Do you agree with that, or is that a reach?
And mentions Trump throughout the ad.
Right. Do you agree with that?
And of course, I had nothing to do with the ad whatsoever. In terms of do I agree with that? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm not going to talk about how Justice Kavanaugh was treated or his confirmation process. But unquestionably, there is an effort to destroy people personally who put themselves out there. And Judge Neubauer is an active participant in that. And she is actually helping to make our judiciary less healthy by engaging in the kind of ad hoc personal attacks and ad hominem attacks that she is.
I'll give you a chance to respond to that. And then back to the original question, which was, do we need to look at doing something different?
I mean, I reject out of hand that I'm engaging in ad hominem attacks. This is about information, and important information that the voters need to know. And we haven't even discussed it all. My opponent in his blog talked about being gay as a condition that could be treated like alcoholism or substance abuse. Again, these are views that were not written by a kid. This was a 27-year-old person. So I do not see this as an attack. I see it as information that the voters need to look at in terms of really deciding on temperament, deciding on impartiality.
On merit selection?
On the merit selection, you know, I've been on both sides of this. I was honored to be on several of the federal nominating committees. And I have to say, in that process, no one ever told me, you know, how I was supposed to come out on things. We truly looked at it on qualifications and merit. In our state, you know, all the support that I'm getting, we want us to get to a place where we are electing people based on experience and qualifications, and whether that means that we need to look seriously at the recusal rule for money, I am all for that. My opponent says I haven't said anything on that. That's not true. I've said I would be definitely in favor of adopting a stronger rule. In terms of commissions, appointments, you know, Wisconsin does have a long history of, you know, a progressive tradition of electing our public officials. As a practical matter, I'm not sure as a state we'd be ready to move away from that. There was a proposal, a very well thought out proposal that the state bar looked at of having one term, 16-year term. I think that was dead on arrival in the legislature. So yes, we need to work as a state. And I'm hoping that my election, because people do understand and trust that I am going to be impartial and not a partisan, I hope my election is a huge signal to our state that we can move in the right direction.
So I was struck by something. Your first debate over in Madison, you were asked by reporter Jessica Arp from Channel 3 over there. about sort of the launch of your campaign, your visual launch of the campaign. And that was, you told a story and did a video that talked about an experience you had in Chicago. Yeah. You told a story about you and your wife adopting your youngest child. I'm wondering if you could do that in a somewhat condensed version, and then I want to get into why that was important to share with people for this campaign. Mm-hmm. Judge Hagedorn, I'll begin with you. The adoption of your youngest child. Why did you want to share that? What does it tell us about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lily's here tonight in the audience with several of my other children as well. My wife and I, we've been married for 17 years. We have 5 children, 15, 13, 11, 8, and 5. And when we first got married, we had talked about adopting, and our heart behind that was just to meet a need somewhere. Didn't know what that would look like, didn't know where that would show up. Back in 2013, we began to explore it, and in a really miraculous series of events within a few weeks, we heard about a birth mom who'd struggled with drugs, a variety of different kinds of drugs, among them opiates. And we got to know them, and they voluntarily chose, birth mom and birth dad, to give their daughter to us. And we were actually invited there to the hospital with her when she was born. We were actually in the delivery room with her when she was born. I was in a strategically placed corner of the delivery room, but I was there nonetheless. And it was beautiful. It was sad. It was all the things that you can imagine. And Lily was in the hospital for about a week, withdrawing from the drugs that she was addicted to, the opiates in that situation. So I've seen firsthand the impact of drug use and how that can tear apart families. I'm proud to have the support of 46 sheriffs across the state of Wisconsin, far more than my opponent, because they understand and trust me to keep our communities safe, that these drug issues are a significant issue in this race and all across the state.
Judge Neubauer?
Yeah, the video that you that you referenced, I talked about really one of the major life-changing events for me when I was 21 years old, and a great impetus for me to decide to go to law school and ultimately to become a judge someday. And that was when I was a student at Madison. I was 21. I went down to Chicago with some friends, and I was illegally strip searched. The police had arrested one of my friends who took a parking ticket off the car, put it back. They arrested him. I went down to get him out, and the officer sent me over to be strip searched. It was something that I knew at the time was unconstitutional because I had taken a law school class on constitutional law, and I decided that I was going to pursue that illegal search. I joined a suit that the ACLU started shortly after that, when other stories revealed that this was a policy that had been going on since 1952 in Chicago. And I actually became Jane Doe #1 in that lawsuit. It was a policy that was applied to women who didn't pay parking tickets, who took illegal left turns, misdemeanors, and the ACLU estimated it impacted 10,000 women. So I was Jane Doe #1 in that lawsuit because I was never arrested. I walked into the station of my own, and also because my friend, who had been arrested for disorderly conduct, was never searched. It changed the rules in Chicago Police Department quickly. It came up here to Wisconsin, where some teachers had been strip searched when they were doing strikes, and the Illinois legislature dealt with it. It was, for me, such a powerful example of how incredibly important it is that we have courts that are there to protect our rights when the other two branches get out of sync and when our rights are violated. So that was a huge. I went to law school at the University of Chicago after that.
I want to touch briefly on this, and we only have a couple minutes left here, but the notion of empathy, because when I hear you tell your story, Judge Hagedorn, about your little girl, it makes me think it's a story of empathy. It's a story of understanding. And you know this. You've heard that one of the qualifications, Barack Obama said he used to look for empathy as a qualification for justices. How do you feel about that? Should empathy be a qualification for a justice on the Wisconsin Supreme Court?
The main job of an appellate judge is to say what the law is and not what they think the law should be. It's not my job to kind of go in and decide who I think got the raw end of the deal. And so if that's what's meant by empathy, no. But certainly, everyone who comes before us, we ought to treat with dignity and respect. When I get a brief that comes before me now as a judge from a pro se defendant who's a prisoner or whatever, and it's maybe tough to read, I read it. I read the whole thing because it's my obligation to do as my oath says, to do justice and to fulfill my oath, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, regardless of where you come from. Everybody should be treated with dignity and respect, absolutely, as a litigant. I don't think that is one of the core jobs, because when we do that, all of a sudden we're substituting our own sense of right and wrong and fairness for what the law says, and that's the danger zone.
I've only got about 20 seconds left. I'll have you respond. Should empathy be a qualification?
Yeah, I think empathy is one of the components of temperament that the voters need to look at. And temperament is a lot of things. It's leadership, it's collegiality, but it's also respect for other people. And, with the 20 seconds, my opponent has really been so disrespectful in so many ways in his writings, and frankly the way he's doing the campaign.
Let me go to closing statements now. I want to make sure you each have a full minute to talk about that. We flipped a coin to determine the order. We will begin with Judge Neubauer. Judge?
Thank you. I am so grateful to have this opportunity to speak directly with the voters about what is such an important race for the future of our state. Again, this race is all about experience, qualifications, merits, and who is going to be somebody you trust to be fair, impartial, independent. I have 30 years in the law, far more experience than my opponent, who barely practiced law before he did a few other things for a few years and joined Governor Walker as his legal counsel for the biggest chunk of his legal career. I am honored in this race to have the support of 98% of the endorsing judges in this race, and I think it's because they see that I have far more experience, far more qualifications, and that I can be trusted to be fair, impartial, and independent, as I have been for 11 years. I ask for your vote.
Judge Hagedorn.
This race is about the future of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And what we've seen here tonight, unfortunately, is my opponent doesn't want it to be about that. She spent the evening trying to malign me personally, and she is trying to sell to the voters something that I'm not. Please don't believe the lies and the caricatures that you see from Judge Neubauer and the liberal special interest groups supporting her. We cannot allow our court to become the political playground of those who have a political agenda for the court. Judge Neubauer is upheld as a model judges who do exactly that. Despite what you hear her saying tonight, that's what she says courts ought to be doing. She's holding that up. My job as a judge, rather, is to say what the law is and not what I think the law should be. I will protect and uphold all of our constitutional rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to bear arms. I'm proud to have the support of the members of the Supreme Court, of 46 sheriffs across the state of Wisconsin, and I would ask all of you to stand with me on April 2nd. Thank you very much.
Judge Hagedorn, Judge Neubauer, thanks very much. We want to thank them for being with us tonight. We want to thank everybody at home who's been watching this last hour. This debate has been a production of WISN 12 News and Marquette University Law School. Election Day is a week from today, Tuesday, April 2nd. We encourage you to get out and vote. Thank you, and have a great evening, everyone.
This has been a special presentation of WISN TV and Marquette University Law School on the Upfront network of ABC stations in Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us.